Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let the modern world dissolve into the heavy, velvet darkness of a time long past. Imagine the scent of wood smoke, the damp chill of river mist, and the sound of a distant bell tolling the curfew. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture stone castles, armored knights, monks in candlelit monasteries, and peasants bent over muddy fields. Rarely do they picture the narrow streets after sunset, where lantern light flickered on wet cobblestones, and another medieval reality quietly unfolded. Prostitution was not a hidden exception to medieval life. It was an accepted, regulated, and deeply entangled part of European society, tolerated, taxed, condemned, and relied upon all at once. In medieval cities, prostitution was not merely common, it was institutional. Town councils, church authorities, and royal officials all knew where brothels stood, who worked inside them, and how much money they generated. Many cities officially licensed brothels, known as stews or common houses, often clustered near city walls, ports, or riverbanks. These locations were chosen deliberately, close enough to serve travelers and soldiers, far enough to keep respectable neighborhoods morally uncontaminated. The justification was practical rather than moral. Medieval authorities widely believed that prostitution prevented greater sins. Church thinkers argued that allowing men access to prostitutes reduced adultery, rape, and sexual violence against honest women. In this logic, prostitution was considered a necessary evil, like garbage collection or slaughterhouses, dirty, unpleasant, but essential to maintaining order. Prostitutes themselves lived at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were legally tolerated, but socially despised. Most were poor women with few alternatives, widows without family support, rural migrants driven into cities by famine, or abandoned wives with no legal means to survive. Once a woman entered prostitution, escape was difficult. Her reputation closed the doors to marriage, guild work, or respectable service. In many cities, prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing, yellow scarves, striped hoods, or specific belts, marking them as outsiders wherever they walked. Life inside a medieval brothel was harsh. The rooms were small, dark, and crowded. Beds were shared, rarely cleaned, and crawling with lice and fleas. Clean water was scarce, and soap was a luxury. Sexually transmitted diseases were widespread, especially after the late 15th century, when syphilis began spreading across Europe. Without effective medical knowledge, infections often led to infertility, chronic pain, or slow death. There was no healthcare safety net. Once a woman became sick, she was usually discarded. Violence was an everyday risk. Clients could be drunk, aggressive, or armed. While brothels were technically protected by law, enforcement was inconsistent. Many brothel keepers were former prostitutes themselves, hardened by experience and more concerned with profit than protection. If a prostitute was beaten or raped by a client, authorities often blamed her for provoking the attack. Justice, like dignity, was rarely on her side. Yet prostitution was also big business. Cities taxed brothels heavily, using the revenue to fund walls, roads, and public works. In some towns, brothels were municipally owned, with profits flowing directly into city coffers. Kings and nobles also benefited indirectly, especially in garrison towns, where soldiers' wages quickly found their way into brothel tills. Morality in this system bowed to economics. Religion's relationship with prostitution was deeply contradictory. Preachers thundered against sexual sin from the pulpit, condemning prostitutes as symbols of moral decay. At the same time, church authorities quietly accepted the trade's existence. Some monasteries even owned properties rented out as brothels, while bishops issued regulations on where prostitutes could operate. During holy days like Easter or Christmas, brothels were temporarily closed, only to reopen once the festival passed, business resuming as usual. Medieval bathhouses blurred the line between hygiene and sex. Public baths were social spaces where men and women sometimes bathed together, and many quietly doubled as brothels. What began as a place to wash became a convenient setting for sexual transactions, especially in cities where private bathing facilities were rare. Authorities periodically attempted to shut these bathhouse brothels down, citing disease and immorality, but enforcement waxed and waned depending on political and economic needs. Not all prostitutes worked in brothels. Many operated independently, soliciting clients in taverns, marketplaces, or along city roads. These women faced even greater danger, lacking the minimal protection that brothel walls provided. Punishments for unlicensed prostitution could be severe: fines, whipping, banishment, or forced shaving of the head. A public act of humiliation meant to strip a woman of femininity and dignity. Occasionally, society offered redemption. Some cities funded Magdalene houses, institutions intended to reform prostitutes through prayer and labor. While presented as charitable, these places were often harsh and prison-like. Women entered voluntarily or were forced and lived under strict discipline. Few truly escaped poverty afterward, but these houses allowed medieval society to maintain the comforting illusion that repentance erased systemic cruelty. Over time, attitudes began to shift. By the late Middle Ages, fears of disease, especially syphilis, and changing religious movements led to harsher crackdowns. Brothels closed, prostitutes were expelled from cities, and tolerance hardened into repression. Yet prostitution never disappeared. It simply moved further into the shadows, becoming more dangerous and less regulated. The filthy truth about medieval prostitution is not just about sex. It is about hypocrisy, survival, and power. Medieval society publicly condemned prostitutes while privately depending on them. It profited from their bodies, blamed them for moral failure, and discarded them when they became inconvenient. These women were not symbols of sin. They were casualties of a world that offered them almost no choices. In the flickering torchlight of medieval streets, prostitution was not an aberration. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, regulated by law, exploited by authority, justified by theology, and endured by women whose names history rarely bothered to record. Their silence, like so much of the Middle Ages, speaks louder than any sermon ever could. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let us drift deeper into this twilight world, moving past the general history and stepping onto the stones ourselves. Imagine you are standing on the south bank of the Thames, looking back towards the walled city of London. The year is somewhere near 1390. The great curfew bell has just rung, signaling that the city gates are shutting for the night, locking the respectable citizens inside and leaving the rest of us out here in the liberty of the clink. The air here tastes different, thick with the smoke of roasting meat, the brine of the river, and the faint, sweet rot of the marshes. This is where the rules of the city fade. You can see the glow of lanterns bobbing in the dark, not the bright, steady light of a cathedral, but the erratic, inviting flicker of the stews. It is a wet night, the kind that seeps into your wool cloak, making the cobblestones slick as oil under your boots. We are walking through a district that exists specifically for pleasure, a place carved out by necessity and greed. Notice the houses along the riverbank. They are not the wattle and daub shacks of the peasantry, but substantial timber-framed buildings with signs painted in bright, gaudy colors. A cardinal's hat, a cross keys, a bell. It seems ironic, doesn't it, that so many brothels bear religious names? But perhaps it isn't irony at all, just a quiet acknowledgement of who owns the land beneath our feet. Historians still argue whether the church's ownership of these brothel lands was a calculated financial strategy or merely an accident of feudal inheritance. But the result was the same. The rent paid by these houses of repair often lined the velvet pockets of bishops. As we walk, you might expect chaos, a brawl spilling out of a tavern, or the shriek of unbridled vice. But look closely. The street is surprisingly orderly. There are guards here, men known as sergeants, employed not to stop the trade, but to ensure the tax is paid and the rules are followed. You see a woman standing near a doorway. She is not hiding in the shadows. She is standing under the light, wearing a hood of striped ray cloth. This isn't a fashion choice. It is a legal requirement, a way for the city to say, "We know what you are." She looks tired, her breath pluming in the cold air, her hands tucked into her sleeves for warmth. She is a daughter of this intricate, contradictory system, waiting for the soldiers from the garrison or the merchants whose ships have just docked at the wharves. The river water laps against the wooden pilings nearby, a rhythmic, soothing sound that hides the filth floating in the current. In this light, everything is softened. The grime of the street is hidden by the dark, the harsh reality of the woman's life obscured by the warm glow of the lantern. We are observers here, ghosts floating through the medieval night, witnessing the intersection of human need and human exploitation. It is a world of transactions, yes, but also a world of survival, where a warm room and a few coins are often the only difference between life and death. The city across the water sleeps under the protection of its walls and its morals. But here, on the wet cobblestones, the city's shadow comes alive, breathing, waiting, and enduring. The map of a medieval city is not merely a diagram of streets and walls. It is a map of morality, a physical blueprint of how a society organizes its conscience. And as we drift away from the damp chill of the London riverbank, we begin to see this pattern repeating across the darkened face of Europe. The placement of the stews is never accidental, for in the medieval mind, a city is like a human body. It has a head for thinking, a heart for prayer, and inevitably, lower regions for the expulsion of waste and the indulgence of baser needs. Saint Augustine himself, a voice echoing from centuries prior, but still loud in the ears of medieval town councils, famously compared prostitution to a cesspool in a palace. "Remove the cesspool," he warned, "and the whole palace will fill with filth." So, the architects of medieval cities build their cesspools with great care, designating specific zones where the filth can be contained, monitored, and taxed. As we float southward, crossing the channel in the blink of an eye to hover over the labyrinthine streets of Paris, We see this containment in action, though it is a containment that leaks at the edges. Here, the designated red light districts are not pushed to the far outskirts, but are woven into the dense, beating heart of the city, often clustered near the universities and the busy marketplaces. The authorities in Paris, ever pragmatic, designate specific streets where the filles de joie, the girls of joy, are permitted to live and work. It is a form of zoning that would make a modern city planner nod in recognition, though the names of these streets leave absolutely nothing to the imagination. Medieval people possess a blunt, earthy honesty that modern sensibilities often lack, and nowhere is this clearer than in their street signs. While we might use polite euphemisms, a medieval town simply names a street after exactly what happens there. In England, countless towns feature a Grope-Cunt Lane, a name that historians note appears in roughly 20 different settlements, from York to Bristol. And while the word might make us blush or giggle in the dark to a medieval pedestrian, it is merely a practical set of directions as functional as Baker Street or Fish Street. It is a little historic joke, really, that a society so obsessed with the spiritual purity of the soul is so relentlessly literal about the activities of the body. These lanes are usually narrow, shadowed alleys, twisting away from the main thoroughfares, designed to offer a modicum of privacy to the respectable merchant who wishes to slip away unnoticed. But let us move south again, gliding over the Alps to the shimmering, watery world of Venice, where the geography of vice takes on a different, almost theatrical character. In Venice, the brothels are not hidden in the mud, but are part of the city's glittering reflection on the canals. Here, in the district of the Rialto, the trade is driven by a unique anxiety. The Venetian authorities are so terrified of sodomy spreading among their men that they actively encourage prostitutes to display themselves, to serve as a distraction. We drift toward the famous Ponte del Tet, or the Bridge of Tits, where the law permits, and sometimes encourages, women to stand with their bodices unlaced, leaning over the balustrades to entice passing gondolas. It is a surreal image, the moonlight catching the pale skin of women framed against the stone arches, a state-sanctioned exhibition designed to engineer the sexual habits of a republic. Yet, even here, amidst the unique aquatic geography of Venice, the rule of containment holds firm, for the bridge acts as a boundary, a line that says vice belongs here and not there. In other cities, the geography is dictated by the defensive walls that encircle the population. Often, the brothels are pushed right up against the city walls, sometimes even tucked into the shadows of the gates themselves. This serves a dual purpose, practical and symbolic. It places the sex trade on the literal margin of society, on the very edge of the civilized world. And it also positions the women to be the first greeting for travelers arriving after a long journey. When the city gates are shut at night, preventing latecomers from entering, the brothels outside the walls remain open, glowing like way stations for the weary and the wicked. In historic Avignon, under the shadow of the papal palace, the geography of the brothel becomes almost monastic. Here, the main brothel is known as the Abbaye, the abbey, and it is run with the strictness of a convent. It is a walled compound within the city, a fortress of vice with its own gatekeeper who locks the women in at night, ensuring that the pollution does not spill out into the holy streets. The irony is palpable as we look down at it. A brothel, structured like a monastery, run by a woman sometimes called the abbess, serving a population of clerics and church officials. It is a closed ecosystem, a city within a city, where the geography of the building itself enforces the social order. As we move through these spaces, notice what lies next to them. The stews are almost always located in the poorest, most industrial quarters of the city. You can smell it before you see it. They sit alongside the tanneries, where leather is cured in vats of urine and dog feces, creating a stench that hangs heavy in the humid air. They are neighbors to the slaughterhouses, the dyers, and the fullers. This is the stinky district, the quarter assigned to everything the city needs but prefers not to smell. The women who work here are geographically bonded to the waste of the city, breathing the same acrid air as the tanners, living in the shadow of the smoke and the steam. It is a sensory map of exclusion. Scholarly debate continues regarding exactly how strict these boundaries were. While the laws on parchment draw clear red lines around these districts, court records suggest a messier reality, where independent sex workers constantly drifted into respectable neighborhoods, prompting repeated frustrated decrees from town councils to get back to the stews. The map, it seems, was always a fantasy of order imposed on a chaotic human reality. And the buildings themselves, what do they feel like? In Southwark, or the rougher parts of Paris, these are not the stone palaces of the wealthy. They are timber-framed, wattle and daub structures, often whitewashed to look cleaner than they are. The signs hanging above the doors creak in the wind, images of swans, boars, or Saracen heads, acting as beacons in a time of illiteracy. The windows are small, covered with oiled paper or heavy shutters to keep the heat in and the prying eyes out. Inside, the geography is intimate and claustrophobic. A central hall for drinking and bargaining, a warm hearth that serves as the heart of the house, and then the small chambers, or cubicles, upstairs. The walls are thin. The sounds of the trade, the laughter, the weeping, the rhythmic creaking of ropes, bleed from one room to another, creating a collective experience of intimacy that offers no true privacy. It is a geography of shared vulnerability. As we hover outside a brothel in a German garrison town, watching the warm yellow light spill onto the snow, we realize that these districts are not just places of sin. They are the pressure valves of the medieval world. They are carefully placed, meticulously named, and rigorously taxed. The city pushes them to the edge, near the river or the wall, hoping to wash away the stain. Yet it anchors them firmly with laws and licenses, terrified to let them go. The geography tells us that these women are necessary outcasts, held at arm's length, but never out of reach. And as we gaze at the women moving behind those shuttered windows, we must ask, who are they? How did they arrive in this district of tanners and shadows? The map tells us where they are, but it does not tell us why. To understand that, we must leave the streets and step into the lives of the women themselves, the daughters of a world that has run out of options. The wind that whistles through the gaps in a medieval window frame carries a cold truth, one that chills the bone far deeper than the winter frost. As we leave the geography of the streets and drift silently through the timber walls into the lives of the women themselves, we must first dismantle a pervasive myth. The medieval pulpit loved to thunder that a prostitute was a creature of insatiable lust, a daughter of Ev, driven by a corrupted flesh that could not be tamed. Sermons painted them as temptresses, seducing innocent men away from the path of righteousness. But if we look closely at the ledger of history, not the sermons, but the tax rolls, the court records, and the quiet, desperate letters, we find that the driving force was rarely sin. It was hunger. The filthy truth is that for a woman in the Middle Ages, the line between respectability and the brothel was terrifyingly thin, often no wider than a single coin. To understand why a woman would step into the yellow light of the stews, we must first understand the crushing economics of being female in a medieval city. A woman alone was an economic anomaly, a ship without an anchor in a storm. If she was lucky, she was born into a family of means, passed from the protection of a father to the protection of a husband, her survival secured by a dowry and a marriage contract. But luck is a finite resource. Consider the widow, perhaps only 20 years old, whose husband dies of a fever or a workplace accident. The guilds often allow her to continue his trade for a short time, but the pressure to remarry or sell the shop is immense. If she has no family to absorb her, she enters the free labor market, and here the medieval world is cruel. A woman spinning wool from dawn until the candle burns low earns a pittance, perhaps a penny or two a day, while an unskilled male laborer earns 3 times that for digging a ditch. She can scrub laundry in the freezing river until her hands are raw and cracked, or sell ale, or mend tunics. But the wages are rarely enough to feed one mouth, let alone a child's. The math is brutal and unforgiving. When the price of bread spikes after a bad harvest, the spinner's wages do not rise to meet it. She starves in slow motion. Then there is the servant girl, the most common recruit for the brothels of Southwark or Paris. Many of these young women migrate from the countryside, fleeing rural poverty with dreams of city wages. They enter the households of merchants or artisans, dependent entirely on their masters for food, shelter, and reputation. It is a precarious existence. If a master, or his son, or his apprentice forces himself upon her, the consequences fall entirely on her shoulders. If she becomes pregnant, she is fired instantly for immorality. A servant fired without a reference is a social pariah. No reputable house will hire her. She finds herself on the street with a growing belly and no coin. It is here, in this moment of absolute freefall, that the brothel keeper appears, not as a villain, but as a savior offering a warm meal and a bed. The brothel keepers, often women themselves, know exactly when to make their offer. They scout the hiring fairs and the city gates, watching for the girls who look lost, cold, and desperate. Historians still argue whether some women used prostitution as a temporary economic strategy rather than a permanent identity. There is evidence, particularly in English towns, of occasional prostitution, women who sold sex only when the rent was due or the harvest failed, returning to honest work when times improved. For these women, their bodies were liquid assets to be liquidated only in emergencies, a grim savings account of last resort. It is a debate that touches on the resilience of the human spirit. Was this a lifetime sentence or a calculated survival tactic? The records show us women who drifted in and out of the trade, suggesting that for the poor, morality was a luxury they could not always afford. You might smile a sad small smile to think that the most sophisticated economic juggling in the Middle Ages was not done by bankers in Florence, but by laundresses in York, trying to balance the cost of a loaf of bread against the price of their own dignity. We must also consider the crushing weight of debt. Once a woman entered a brothel, the stewholder often entrapped her in a cycle of financial obligation. The keeper would charge the women for their room, their food, and even the clothes they wore, often at exorbitant rates. A woman might arrive owning nothing but her shift. The keeper would provide a fine gown of red velvet or green wool to attract clients. But the cost of the gown was added to her debt. Every meal added to the debt. Every cup of watered-down wine added to the debt. She was working not for profit, but to pay off a sum that mysteriously grew larger every week. It was a form of indentured servitude disguised as commerce. In some cases, the city laws actually tried to regulate this, forbidding keepers from lending more than a certain amount to their girls. But in the dark, quiet rooms of the brothel, the law was a distant whisper compared to the immediate power of the madam. There is another, even more tragic path: the dowry earner. In some parts of southern Europe, particularly in France and Italy, there are whispers in the archives of young women entering the trade specifically to earn a dowry. In a society where a woman cannot marry without bringing money to the union, prostitution becomes a paradoxical means to achieve respectability. She sells herself now so that she might buy a husband later. It is a heartbreaking gamble, trading present shame for future security. And while the church condemned it, the community often looked the other way, understanding the brutal logic of the marketplace. As we watch a young woman, let us call her Alice, walking through the rain-slicked streets of 14th century Bristol, we see the moment the choice is made. She is cold. Her shoes are worn through, the wet cobblestones numbing her feet. She has not eaten since yesterday morning. She passes a bakery and smells the hot, yeasty scent of fresh bread, a scent that makes her stomach cramp with longing. She passes a tavern and hears the roar of a fire and the clink of pewter mugs. She has tried to find work. She has asked at the weaver's, the alehouse, the market stalls. They all said no. Then she sees the lane where the lanterns burn a little longer. She knows what happens there. She knows the sermons say it is the path to hell, but hell feels very far away, and the cold is very near. She does not step into that lane because she is full of lust. She steps into it because she is full of a terrifying, hollow silence where her future used to be. The transaction is simple: survival for a piece of herself. In this light, the prostitutes of the Middle Ages are not the villains of the story. They are the casualties of an economic system that valued women only as wives or workers and failed them when they could be neither. They are the daughters of necessity, forging a life in the gaps where society has crumbled. And once Alice steps into that lane, once she takes the coin and the name that comes with it, the city will mark her. It will not be enough to simply know what she does. The medieval world, with its obsession for order and labels, will insist that she wear her profession on her skin. She has crossed a line, and soon the law will compel her to dress the part, to wrap herself in the colors of her trade so that no honest woman might ever be mistaken for her. The yellow cord is waiting. In a world without photographs or identification cards, the medieval eye was trained to read the language of cloth with forensic precision. A man's status was woven into the wool of his tunic. A woman's virtue was pinned to the veil covering her hair. As we glide through the bustling midday market of a generic medieval city, perhaps Lyon or Frankfurt or London, the crowd is a swirling tapestry of social codes. Monks in rough brown wool, merchants in broadcloth, dyed rich hues of madder and woad, and knights in silks brought from the east. But amidst this sea of defined rules, the city authorities faced a terrifying ambiguity. Without a label, a prostitute might look exactly like a respectable wife. This confusion was intolerable to the medieval mind, which craved order above all else. If a man could not tell the difference between a common woman and a lady at a glance, the entire social hierarchy threatened to dissolve into chaos. And so, the law reached out with a needle and thread to stitch the stigma directly onto the bodies of the women who worked in the shadows. This brings us to the visual branding of the sex trade, the sumptuary laws. These were intricate, obsessive regulations dictating exactly what each class of person could wear, down to the inch of fur lining or the cost of a ribbon. For the prostitute, the goal was twofold: to shame her as an outcast and to advertise her as a commodity. In England, specifically in the shadowed lanes of London and Bristol, the mark was the hood of Ray. Ray was a striped cloth, visually jarring and distinct. While stripes might seem innocuous to us, a pattern for beach umbrellas or business suits, in the medieval imagination, stripes were deeply suspect. Historians and symbologists, such as Michel Pastoureau, have noted that in medieval iconography, stripes were the uniform of the disrupted and the dangerous. Court jesters, executioners, Judas Iscariot, and prostitutes. The stripe breaks the visual field. It refuses to be solid, pure, or whole. To force a woman to wear a striped hood was to mark her as a creature of disorder. A divided woman who belonged to everyone and no one. Crossing the Channel to France, the code shifts from pattern to color. Here, the color of sin is yellow. In many French municipalities, prostitutes were required by law to wear a yellow cord, an armband, or a specific yellow tassel on their shoulder. Yellow was the color of treason, of bile, and of sulfur. It was the color often forced upon Jewish communities in similar acts of segregation, linking religious othering with sexual othering. Imagine a woman standing in the grey stone plaza of a cathedral. The law demands she wear a bright yellow aiguillette, a knotted cord, conspicuously on her shoulder. It acts as a beacon. To the men passing by, it is a menu. To the honest women pulling their skirts away as they pass, it is a warning. She is a marked tree in the forest, designated for a specific kind of timber. However, the filthiest truth of these laws is that they were often born not just from moral outrage, but from jealousy and class anxiety. You see, despite their poverty, many prostitutes were the fashion trendsetters of their day. In a time when a respectable wife was expected to dress modestly, covering her hair and hiding her shape, the prostitute lived by her ability to attract attention. They were the ones wearing the tightest bodices, the brightest dyes, and the most daring necklines. They mimicked the aristocracy. There are frantic records from town councils complaining that prostitutes were strutting through the streets in furs, silks, and embroidered belts, looking for all the world like countesses. This terrified the nobility. It was an inversion of the natural order. If a prostitute could wear the same squirrel fur lining as a merchant's wife, how could the merchant's wife feel superior? The sumptuary laws, therefore, were often a desperate attempt to strip the glamour away. In London, It was forbidden for a common woman to wear any lining of pure fur or any fabric of a certain high value. In Bologna, they were banned from wearing pearls or silk veils. Yet, enforcement was a constant, exhausting game of cat and mouse. We can imagine the scene in a brothel when the rumor spreads that the city constables are on a sweep. Women scrambling to hide their forbidden velvet sleeves, tearing the silver buttons off a bodice to stash them under a loose floorboard. The penalties for being caught dressing above one's station were humiliating. In some cities, the constable had the right to strip the offending garment off the woman's back right there in the street. Imagine the sudden violence of it. A woman walking proudly in a cloak lined with illicit rabbit fur, only to be stopped, the cloak seized and confiscated, leaving her shivering in her shift while the crowd jeers. It was a public unmasking, a physical reminder that her body was not her own to adorn. There is a soft, dark humor to be found in the loopholes, however. Human ingenuity rarely bows completely to the law. In some German cities, when prostitutes were forbidden from wearing gold jewelry, they simply began sewing gold thread into the hem of their undergarments, or wearing elaborate, flashy shoes that technically didn't break the rules on clothing. It was a subtle rebellion, a way of keeping a spark of individuality alive under the heavy blanket of regulation. The yellow cord might have been a badge of shame, but for some it became a badge of identity, a way to signal to their sisters in the trade, we are the ones who survive. Let us pause and look at a specific figure, a woman named Margot in 15th century Paris. The law says she must wear the mark. She pins the yellow band to her sleeve. She hates it. It makes her skin crawl, this bright, screaming announcement of her status. But as she steps out into the muddy street, she notices something. A man, a wealthy burgher in a heavy cloak, spots the yellow flash. He slows his pace. He meets her eye. The mark that was meant to shame her also grants her a strange specific power. It cuts through the pretense. There is no need for subtle courtship, no need for the dangerous dance of wondering if she is willing. The yellow cord says yes. It transforms her from a person into a destination. She navigates the crowd, a ship flying a pirate flag, and while the respectable matrons glare with a mixture of disgust and secret curiosity, Margot knows that her yellow armlet is also a shield. It keeps the confused away. It defines the transaction, but the psychological weight of the close is heavy. To never be able to take a walk just to feel the sun, to never be able to enter a church without heads turning, this is a profound isolation. The clothing laws created a mobile prison. Even when she was not working, even when she was buying turnips or visiting a sick friend, the clothes trapped her in her role. She could not switch off. She was a prostitute in the morning light and a prostitute in the evening shade. The dye of the cloth seeped into the skin of her identity. As the sun sets over the city, the colors of the day fade into the gray of twilight. The yellow cords and striped hoods lose their vibrance in the dark, blending back into the shadows. The visual codes that separate the clean from the unclean dissolve, leaving only the reality of bodies in the night. The city council can pass all the laws it wants, dictating who wears wool and who wears silk. But in the dark, the distinction blurs. And it is here, in this blurred morality, that we find the greatest hypocrite of all. For the very institutions that demanded these women wear the badge of shame, the pillars of spiritual authority, were often the ones collecting the rent on the roofs over their heads. As we follow the clinking of coins from the brothel keeper's purse, we find that the trail does not lead to a criminal underworld, but up the hill, past the market, and through the heavy oak doors of the bishop's palace. The yellow cord may mark the woman, but the gold coin knows no sin. If money could speak, the coins circulating in medieval London would scream. As we follow a silver groat, a small battered coin passing from the rough hand of a riverboat captain into the palm of a brothel keeper, and then, days later, into the velvet purse of a rent collector, we arrive at the most bewildering destination of all. The coin does not stop at a tavern or a gambling den. It travels up the hierarchy, past the merchants and the knights, and comes to rest in the coffers of the church. Here lies the deepest, most uncomfortable knot in the medieval psyche. The fact that the greatest landlord of the red light districts was often the very institution sworn to save souls from the sins of the flesh. The bishop was not merely a spiritual shepherd. He was a commercial landlord, and his tenants were the women he condemned from the pulpit. Nowhere is this unholy alliance more visible or more famous than in Southwark, the gritty borough we visited earlier, just across the bridge from London. This area is known as the Liberty of the Clink, a name that still echoes in our modern slang for prison. But the liberty here refers to a legal loophole. This land falls outside the jurisdiction of the City of London's mayor. Instead, it belongs to the Bishop of Winchester. Imagine the scene: a magnificent episcopal palace, built of grey stone and surrounded by lush gardens, rising from the riverbank. It is a place of high theology and political maneuvering, and directly next to its walls, nestled in the bishop's own shadow, are the stew houses. The bishop can look out his high-arched window, breathe in the morning air, and watch the women of the night washing their linen in the river. He is their landlord. He signs the leases. He collects the rents. The women who work here are known, with a biting, cynical wit that only the Middle Ages could produce, as Winchester geese. To be bitten by a Winchester goose is a euphemism for contracting a venereal disease, a grim joke that ties the bishop's name forever to the burning itch of infection. How did the church justify this? How could a man preach chastity in the morning and count the profits of fornication in the afternoon? To understand this, we must step into the cool, quiet library of medieval theology. The justification relies on the sewer metaphor we touched upon earlier, championed by heavyweights like St. Augustine and later refined by Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, the intellectual titan of the era, wrote with cool pragmatism that prostitution in a city is like a cesspit in a palace. Take away the sewer, and you will fill the palace with pollution. In their view, male lust was an unstoppable hydraulic force, a flood that would inevitably burst its banks. If there were no brothels to catch this flood, it would destroy the foundations of society. Men would seduce honest wives, deflower virgins, or turn to unnatural acts with each other. Therefore, the church reasoned, the brothel was a firebreak. By profiting from it, the bishop was not endorsing sin. He was managing a necessary civic hygiene facility. It is a mental gymnastic routine of Olympic caliber, allowing the church to hold its nose with one hand while extending the other for payment. This relationship was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was bureaucratized. The Bishop of Winchester held a private court, the Court Leet, which met regularly to regulate the brothels on his land. We can sit in the back of this dusty room and watch the proceedings. It is shockingly mundane. The bishop's officers are not there to banish the women. They are there to fine them. There is a fine for keeping a brothel open on a holy day, a fine for selling food or ale without a license, a fine for detaining a woman against her will, a rule that, to their credit, the church courts often enforced more strictly than secular ones. But here is the trick. The fines are consistent. They are not punishments designed to stop the behavior. They are operating costs. The brothel keepers pay the fine, the scribe notes it in the ledger, and the business continues. It is, in essence, a licensing fee by another name. The church converts the sin into silver, scrubbing it clean through the bureaucracy of the court. Historians still debate the extent of this complicity across Europe. While the bishops of Winchester are the most notorious examples, they were not alone. In Avignon, under the papacy, the church owned brothels. In Rome itself, the courtesan became a fixture of the ecclesiastical economy. However, some scholars argue that the church was trapped by inheritance laws, often receiving land in wills that happened to have brothels on them, and simply took the pragmatic route of collecting rent rather than evicting tenants and leaving buildings empty. It is a generous interpretation, suggesting the church was a reluctant landlord, but the sheer scale of the profits suggests that reluctance often gave way to convenience. There is a heartbreaking sensory detail that cuts through this administrative cynicism. It is found in the soil. The Winchester geese lived on the bishop's land, paid the bishop's rent, and obeyed the bishop's court. But when they died, the transaction ended abruptly. By the laws of the church, a woman who sold her body remained in a state of mortal sin unless she repented on her deathbed, a luxury of time that sudden fevers or knife fights rarely allowed. Therefore, she could not be buried in consecrated ground. She could not rest in the parish churchyard with her parents or her neighbors. In Suffolk, there is a plot of land known as Crossbones. It is an unconsecrated graveyard, a final dumping ground for the single women of the stews. If we stand there in the moonlight, the tragedy is palpable. The church was happy to take their living, warm currency, but it refused their cold, dead bones. They were tenants in life, but outcasts in death. This exclusion created a strange, insular culture among the women. Since the church rejected them spiritually, while exploiting them financially, they formed their own quiet networks of faith. We find wills where prostitutes leave money to specific altars, or to buy candles for the Virgin Mary, hoping that a direct appeal to the Mother of God might bypass the judgment of the bishop. There is a profound human vulnerability in this. A woman labeled a sinner by the priest, yet still lighting a candle in the dark, hoping that heaven has a back door that the clergy doesn't control. The hypocrisy of the bishop's tenants is perhaps the most defining feature of medieval prostitution. It shatters the simple image of a pious society battling against vice. Instead, it reveals a society that has monetized vice, integrating it into the very foundations of its holiest institutions. The bishop's palace and the brothel are not opposites. They are neighbors, connected by a flow of silver and a shared belief that the world is a fallen, dirty place that must be managed rather than fixed. As we turn away from the cold irony of the bishop's ledger, the air around us begins to change. The chill of the graveyard and the dry dust of the court fade, replaced by a thick, humid warmth. We can hear the sound of splashing water, the hiss of steam on hot stones, and the murmur of relaxed voices. We are leaving the legalistic world of the church and entering a space where the boundaries between health, hygiene, and pleasure dissolve completely. The brothel was one thing, but the medieval bathhouse is another world entirely. A place of steam, skin, and secrets, where the naked truth of the Middle Ages is impossible to hide. The air inside the bathhouse is heavy enough to wear. As we slip through the low wooden door, leaving the biting wind of the street behind, we are immediately enveloped in a thick, white fog that smells of wood smoke, wet cedar, and the pungent sweetness of rosewater trying to mask the scent of unwashed bodies. We have entered the stew, a word that has shifted in meaning over the centuries, from a description of a stove or heated room to a synonym for the brothel itself. In the 13th and 14th centuries, before the great fear of plague and pox shuts them down, these bathhouses are the beating heart of urban social life, a place where the strict boundaries of medieval society soften in the steam. Visually, the scene is a chaotic masterpiece of flesh and timber. The room is large, stone-floored, and lined with great wooden tubs, like halved wine barrels, each big enough to hold 2 or 3 people. In more expensive establishments, there are canvas canopies draped over the tubs to trap the heat, creating intimate, tented worlds within the larger hall. Servants rush back and forth with buckets of scalding water heated in the great cauldrons in the back, their faces flushed red from the exertion. And the noise. It is not the hushed whisper of a modern spa. It is a raucous din of laughter, splashing, and the clattering of pewter plates. For the medieval bath is not a solitary ritual of hygiene. It is a banquet. Planks of wood are laid across the rims of the tubs to serve as tables, laden with jugs of spiced wine, roasted birds, and white bread. People are eating, drinking, and gambling with dice while submerged up to their chests in hot water. It is a level of multitasking that commands a certain begrudging respect. Historians often fight a constant battle against the popular myth that medieval people were universally filthy, allergic to water, and smelled like old cheese. The existence of these bathhouses proves otherwise. In cities like Paris, there were dozens of étuves operating at the height of the Middle Ages, and the Guild of Bathkeepers was powerful and wealthy. The Crusaders, returning from the East with memories of the sophisticated hammams of the Islamic world, had helped reignite a taste for steam and scrub. But here, in the dim light of the European bathhouse, the pursuit of cleanliness is inextricably tangled with the pursuit of pleasure. The line between a legitimate bathhouse and a brothel is not just blurred, it is practically non-existent. While some establishments maintain a strict segregation of the sexes, men on Tuesdays, women on Thursdays, many operate with a wink and a nod. In these mixed houses, men and women bathe together, sometimes naked, sometimes in thin linen shifts that cling and reveal more than they hide when wet. The intimacy of the shared water breaks down the social distance. A merchant might find himself soaking next to a knight or a visiting cleric, and moving through the steam like wraiths are the bath attendants. In theory, their job is to rub down the clients with rough cloths, shave beards, and trim hair. Barber surgeons often operated out of these places, offering bloodletting alongside a wash. But in practice, many of the female attendants are providing services that go far beyond a simple scrub. The architecture facilitates this slide from hygiene to sex. The main hall is for show, for the communal soak and the shared meal. But look toward the back or up the narrow wooden stairs. There are private chambers, retiring rooms, furnished with beds. A client might start in the tub, sharing wine and conversation with an attendant, and then retire to a dry room for rest. The bathhouse keeper charges for the water, the wine, the food, and the room, creating a diversified business model that makes it difficult for authorities to prosecute. If the constable asks, they are simply selling hot water and towels. It is the perfect cover. The steam obscures everything, faces, intentions, and the strict moral codes of the outside world. There is a fascinating cultural anxiety surrounding these places. The church hates them, naturally. Preachers rail against the stews as places where the devil lurks in the hot water, warning that the heat inflames the blood and leads inevitably to lust. They are not entirely wrong about the biology, even if their theology is harsh. The warm water relaxes the muscles, and the wine loosens the tongue. But the medical community of the time is divided. Some medieval physicians praise the bath for opening the pores and balancing the humors, while others warn that open pores allow bad air or miasma to enter the body, causing disease. This medical debate will eventually turn tragic. But for now, in the high medieval period, the pleasure outweighs the fear. Let us focus on a specific detail, the bath money. In some German cities, it was customary for a man to give a bath penny to a girl he fancied, an invitation to join him. It was a courtship ritual stripped of all pretense, acted out in a public space. And yet, there is a vulnerability here too. In the bath, stripped of their tunics, their belts, their swords, and their hoods, people are just pink, soft flesh. The imposing armor of the knight is piled in a corner. The velvet robe of the merchant hangs on a peg. In the steam, the rigid class structure of the Middle Ages melts a little. A naked duke looks remarkably like a naked baker, a fact that must have been both titillating and unsettling to a society built on hierarchy. However, the golden age of the bathhouse brothel is living on borrowed time. We can already sense the shadows creeping in. As the 15th century progresses, the fear of contagion begins to rise. Syphilis has not yet arrived to deliver the death blow. But other outbreaks, plague, sweat sickness, make people suspicious of communal water. The authorities begin to tighten the screws. They mandate that married men cannot go to the stews, or that Jews and Christians cannot bathe together, or that priests must stay away. A rule flouted with impressive regularity. But for this moment, suspended in the humidity of a Parisian afternoon, the bathhouse remains a sanctuary of the senses. The sensory experience is total. The feeling of the hot water after weeks of cold drafts, the taste of spiced wine, the sound of a lute being played softly in the corner, the strings struggling to stay in tune in the damp air, the sight of flushed skin in the lantern light. It is a place of escape. But escape is expensive. Someone has to pay for the wood that heats the water, for the wine, and for the women. And this brings us to the other half of the equation. We have looked at the women, the laws, the buildings, and the bishops. Now, we must turn our gaze to the men standing at the door, clutching their purses. Who are they? Who are the men wandering into the steam and the shadows? They are not just the wicked or the deviant. They are the pillars of society, the scholars, the soldiers, the fathers and the sons, and their reasons for being here are as complex as the era itself. The wooden door of the bathhouse opens, spilling light and steam into the street, and through it steps a young man. He is adjusting his tunic, his face flushed with wine and heat, and as he walks away, he hums a bawdy tune in fractured Latin. If we follow him, he does not lead us to a criminal den or a thieves' guild, but to the hallowed halls of a university. To understand the medieval sex trade, we must look at the men who fueled it, and the largest, most reliable engine of this economy was a demographic specific to the era: the wandering scholar. In cities like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, thousands of young men were gathered together, far from the supervision of their parents, forbidden from marrying while in minor orders, and bursting with the restless energy of youth. They were the gown in the eternal battle of town versus gown, and they treated the brothels as an extension of the lecture hall, a place to prove their manhood, spend their allowance, and escape the dry logic of Aristotle. The medieval university student is a fascinating paradox. Legally, he is a cleric, under the protection of the church, which means he cannot be tried by secular courts. This legal immunity often bred a terrifying arrogance. We see groups of students roaming the streets of the Latin Quarter in Paris, armed with daggers and clubs, terrorizing the local watch. For these young men, visiting a brothel is not a shameful secret. It is a performative act of masculinity. Historians like Ruth Mazocaras have argued that for medieval students, sexuality was less about the woman and more about impressing other men. To be a real man was to be sexually active, dominant, and capable. The brothel was the stage where this identity was forged. In the letters sent home to fathers, they beg for money for books and parchment. In the ledgers of the city, that money appears in the tills of the wine shop and the stews. There is a dark humor in the complaints of university chancellors who constantly issue decrees forbidding students from bringing loose women into the colleges, decrees that have to be repeated so often that we know they were entirely ignored. But the students are not the only ones trapped in a state of enforced bachelorhood. Walk down to the artisan quarter, past the workshops of the goldsmiths and the weavers. Here, we find the apprentices. The structure of the medieval guild system created a massive population of sexually frustrated young men. To become a master, a boy had to serve an apprenticeship that could last 7 to 10 years. During this time, he lived in his master's house and was strictly forbidden to marry. Marriage was a privilege of the master, the end point of the career. So from the age of 14 to perhaps 25 or 30, a large portion of the male population was legally single, employed, and living in a city full of temptation. The guildmasters knew this. They knew that a house full of teenage boys was a powder keg. As a result, the visit to the brothel was tacitly accepted as a necessary release valve, a way to keep the apprentices from seducing the master's wife or daughters. It was a calculated compromise. Better they spend a few pennies in the stews than cause chaos at home. Then there are the men of iron, the soldiers. If the student and the apprentice are the steady clientele, the soldier is the boom and bust economy. In garrison towns or ports where armies gather before a campaign, the arrival of the troops transforms the landscape of prostitution overnight. These men are paid in cash. They live with the constant specter of death, and they have little use for long-term planning. When a company of archers or men-at-arms rides into town, the brothels filled to bursting. But the relationship between the military and prostitution goes deeper than just commerce. It is logistical. Medieval armies were actually moving cities. Following the baggage train of every great army was a massive contingent of women, laundresses, cooks, and prostitutes. In some campaigns, the number of women almost equaled the number of men. Commanders struggled with this. Some tried to banish the women, fearing they slowed the march and spread disease. Others, more pragmatic, organized them. There are records of a dedicated official known as the Marshal of the Whores in some armies, an officer whose actual job was to police the camp followers, settle disputes, and ensure that the women were kept in their own designated section of the camp. It brings a startling bureaucratic order to the chaos of war. Even amidst the mud and blood of a siege, someone was responsible for managing the sex trade. And what of the married men? The respectable burghers, the fathers of families? Here we encounter the double standard in its most rigid form. In the medieval legal mind, adultery was a crime defined by the status of the woman. If a husband slept with a prostitute, it was a sin, certainly, a matter for confession. But it was not legally adultery, because the prostitute had no honor to violate. It was considered a minor lapse, a fornication. But if a wife slept with another man, it was treason against the marriage, a catastrophe that ruined bloodlines and inheritance. This legal asymmetry gave married men a hall pass to the brothel. We find court records of men caught in brothels who simply pay a small fine and walk away, their reputations barely scratched. The brothel, therefore, acted as a stabilizer for the medieval marriage, or so the men told themselves. By buying sex elsewhere, they argued, they were sparing their wives from their excessive demands, or protecting the sanctity of the marital bed from their baser urges. It is a logic that rings hollow to modern ears, but it was a sturdy shield for the medieval conscience. Occasionally, the curtain slips, and we see the sheer variety of men in a single snapshot. A court case from 14th century London lists the men arrested in a sweep of a brothel: a priest, 2 friars, a knight, a chaotic mix of apprentices, and a handful of foreign sailors. It is a cross-section of the entire male population. The priest's presence is particularly jarring, yet entirely predictable. Despite the Gregorian reforms demanding clerical celibacy, the priest's concubine was a stock character in medieval village life, and the visiting cleric was a regular at the city stews. The church hierarchy fought a losing battle against the biology of its own workforce. In some regions, bishops gave up trying to enforce celibacy and simply charged priests a cradle tax for every child they fathered. Another instance of monetization replacing morality. As we watch these men, the flushed student, the tired soldier, the furtive merchant, we realize that the brothel is not on the fringe of their lives. It is woven into the timeline of their masculinity. It is where they go to celebrate, to mourn, to bond, and to escape. The money they drop into the women's hands carries the weight of their specific burdens. The stress of the exam, the fear of the battle, the boredom of the workshop. They leave the brothel and return to their respectable lives, to the pulpit, the podium, and the parade ground, leaving the women to hold the secrets they left behind. The women absorb the city's tension. But there is a price to be paid for this vast, unspoken exchange of fluids and frustrations. The body is fragile. In a world without antibiotics, where the understanding of anatomy is a mix of astrology and guesswork. The intimate contact of the brothel is a game of Russian roulette. As the years pass, the laughter in the bathhouse begins to sound a little more brittle, for there are shadows lengthening in the corners, not just of moral judgment, but of physical decay. We must now turn to the medicine cabinet of the Middle Ages to see how this world tried to heal the wounds it inflicted upon itself and found that its cures were often as dangerous as the diseases. When the sun rises over the city, stripping away the romantic haze of the lantern light, it reveals the medieval body in all its fragile, unguarded reality. The morning light in a brothel chamber is unforgiving. It falls on skin marked by flea bites, old scars, and the telltale rashes of a profession that ground the flesh down to the bone. We must now step into the shadow of the apothecary's shelf and the barber surgeon's tent to examine the medical reality of the medieval sex trade. It is a world where science is a muddled soup of astrology, ancient Greek philosophy, and desperate folklore, and where the cure is often just as agonizing as the disease. Long before the great scourge of syphilis arrives to terrify the continent, the stews are already stalked by a persistent, painful companion known simply as the burning. Medieval medical texts refer to it as brenning or ashura, a condition we would likely recognize today as gonorrhea or chlamydia. It was so common in the red light districts that it was treated less like a catastrophe and more like an occupational hazard akin to a coal miner's cough. But do not mistake familiarity for comfort. The pain was excruciating. Without antibiotics, a bacterial infection could fester for years, leading to strictures, infertility, and chronic agony. The medieval understanding of this ailment was typically galenic. They believed it was caused by an overheating of the body's humors, a literal boiling over of blood and bile caused by excessive friction and lust. The treatments for the burning range from the culinary to the horrific. A visit to the local barber surgeon, the man who cuts hair on Tuesday and amputates limbs on Wednesday, might result in a prescription of cooling diets, lettuce, cucumber, and gallons of watered milk to cool the blood. If that failed, things got sharper. Men were subjected to injections of strange, caustic fluids directly into the urethra, using metal syringes that looked more like torture devices than medical instruments. For the women, the treatments were often poultices of herbs, vinegar, and sometimes lead or mercury, applied directly to the skin. Mercury, the heavy, shimmering metal that drives men mad, was already being used in the Middle Ages for various skin diseases, a toxic precursor to the heavy-handed chemical warfare that would come later. But a far darker shadow loomed over the medieval prostitute, the specter of leprosy. In the medieval mind, leprosy was not just a bacterial infection, it was a moral stain, an outward sign of inner corruption. Tragically, the symptoms of advanced sexually transmitted diseases, lesions, skin ulcers, facial disfigurement, often mimicked the early stages of leprosy. Historians have long debated how many women banished to the leprosaria, leper colonies, were actually suffering from untreated STAs. It is a terrifying thought. A woman develops a rash from her work. The neighbors whisper, the authorities are called. She is examined by a jury of matrons or a priest, declared unclean, and cast out of the city forever to live in a colony of the living dead, ringing a bell to warn others of her approach. To be misdiagnosed was a life sentence of isolation. all because medical science could not distinguish between the sins of the skin and the rot of the nerves. Beyond disease, there was the constant, pressing reality of fertility. A prostitute's livelihood depended on her not being pregnant. A woman with a child was harder to sell, harder to house, and harder to feed. Here we encounter a massive historical myth that medieval people had no birth control. In reality, the medieval world was filled with contraceptive knowledge, whispered from woman to woman in the privacy of the kitchen or the bedchamber. It was not perfect, and it was certainly not approved by the church, but it existed. The filthy truth is that the prostitutes were often the most knowledgeable pharmacists in the city. They used barrier methods that would make a modern doctor wince. Sponges soaked in vinegar or olive oil, or pessaries made from binding herbs. They knew the rhythm of the moon and their own bodies better than any university-trained physician. But when prevention failed, they turned to the EMs. Herbal manuals of the time are full of recipes for provoking the flowers or restoring the menses, polite euphemisms for inducing miscarriage. Herbs like pennyroyal, rue, savor, and tansy were brewed into bitter, potent teas. These were dangerous plants. A dose too weak did nothing, while a dose too strong could stop a woman's heart, along with her pregnancy. It was a game of botanical Russian roulette, played in secret, with the woman's life as the wager. We must also consider the physical toll of the environment itself. The brothel was cold, damp, and smoky. Tuberculosis, or consumption, thrived in these cramped spaces. A woman coughing blood into a rag was a common sight. Her pale skin and feverish bright eyes, perhaps even fetishized by some clients as a tragic kind of beauty. There was no maternity leave, no sick pay. If a woman was too ill to work, she was often turned out onto the street by the brothel keeper to make room for a healthy replacement. We see this in the coroner's rolls. Bodies of women found in ditches or under bridges died of the cold or died of the pox. Nameless casualties of a business model that treated human beings as perishable goods. Yet, amidst this grim reality, there is a strange resilience. We find evidence of women looking after each other. A court record from York mentions a prostitute stealing food to feed a sick friend. In London, there are wills where women leave their best blankets or a small stash of coins to a sister who is ailing. In a world that offered them no safety net, they tried to weave their own out of small acts of theft and charity. The barber surgeon, that central figure of medieval healthcare, deserves a closer look. He was often a frequent visitor to the stews, not just as a client, but as a contractor. He would arrive with his bag of knives and jars, a figure of fear and relief. He lanced the boils, pulled the rotten teeth, and set the broken bones that came from the violence of the trade. But his knowledge was limited. He might prescribe a charm, written on parchment, to be worn around the neck to ward off infection. A blend of magic and medicine that we might smile at today, until we realize it was the only health insurance these women had. Abracadabra, scrolled in dog's blood, is not much of a cure. But when you are burning with fever in a drafty room, you will wear it and pray it works. There is a scholarly debate regarding the condom in the Middle Ages, while the rubber prophylactic is a modern invention. There are obscure references to linen sheaths or animal bladders, used potentially for protection against disease. Though most historians argue these were rare and more likely used in the Renaissance. For the medieval woman, The barrier was usually chemical or magical, not physical. She relied on the vinegar sponge and the prayer to Saint Roche, the patron saint of plague victims. As the morning wears on, the apothecary's shop opens, the smell of dried sage and crushed beetles wafting into the street. The prostitute who visits him must be careful. If she asks for too much pennyroyal, he might suspect her of abortion and report her to the church court. She has to play a role, complaining of a stomachache or a blockage of the liver, speaking in the coded language of female survival. It is a dance of deception performed over a counter of dried herbs. This medical reality, the constant pain, the fear of the burning, the terror of the leper's bell, and the dangerous tea brewed in the dark, is the physical price of the coin. The body is the machine of the trade, and the machine is breaking down. But as long as the machine can still function, as long as the pain can be numbed with wine or hidden with lead-white makeup, the trade continues. The coin must flow. And speaking of the coin, it is time we followed the money all the way to the top. We have seen the bishop's cut, but what of the city itself? How did the town council, the group of respectable merchants who ran the civic life, reconcile their ledgers with their morals? We must step into the town hall, where the clinking of gold drowns out the coughing of the sick. From the damp, herbal-scented air of the apothecary's shop, we drift upward, rising above the narrow streets to the high slate-roofed seat of power, the town hall. Here, in the council chamber, the air smells of beeswax polish, expensive fur, and the dry, dusty scent of parchment. A fire crackles in a grand stone hearth, warming the backs of the serious men who sit around a heavy oak table. These are the aldermen, the burghers, the fathers of the city. They are discussing the budget. They speak of repairing the city wall, paving the market square, and dredging the river. And to pay for these civic virtues, they are counting on the reliable, steady stream of silver that flows from the great house by the city gate. The filthy truth that history often politely obscures is that in many medieval cities, the municipality itself was the pimp. While the church in Suffolk played the landlord in other parts of Europe, particularly in Germany and southern France, the city council cut out the middleman and ran the brothels directly. These were the Frauenhäuser, or women's houses, municipal institutions managed with the same bureaucratic rigor as the town weigh house or the salt depot. The logic was ruthlessly pragmatic. If vice was inevitable, as the theologians claimed, then it should be profitable for the public good. Why let a private madam keep the profits when they could be used to fix the potholes in the high street? In cities like Nördlingen or Nuremberg, the town council actually appointed the brothel keeper, a civil servant who swore an oath of office just like the market inspector. He was given a budget, a set of keys, and a mandate to keep the peace and the books balanced. Imagine the job interview for such a position. The candidate had to be a man of good standing, tough enough to handle drunk soldiers, but organized enough to manage the accounts. He was often married, and his wife would serve as the matron of the house, looking after the girls and holding the keys to the linen chest. It was a family business, subsidized by the taxpayer. The city provided the building, the furniture, and sometimes even a clothing allowance for the women to ensure they looked presentable for the honor of the town. There is a bizarre form of civic pride at work here. A town with a clean, well-regulated brothel was seen as a well-ordered town, a place where the needs of visitors were efficiently met. When a high-ranking dignitary, such as a visiting prince or emperor, came to town, the city would often offer him and his retinue free entry to the municipal brothel as part of the official hospitality package, right alongside the ceremonial wine and the key to the city. The women were, in effect, ambassadors of the flesh. Their bodies used to grease the wheels of diplomacy. Let us follow the coin again. In the French court, there existed a peculiar official known as the Roi des Ribauds, the king of the ribbalds. He was a minor court functionary, but his power was absolute within his domain. He was responsible for policing the prostitutes who followed the court, settling their disputes, and crucially, collecting the tax they owed for the privilege of working near the king. This tax wasn't hidden. It was a line item in the royal accounts. In the English borough of Southwark, the sheriff's fines became a predictable revenue stream. The authorities would conduct searches of the brothels, ostensibly to look for rule breakers, but the regularity of the fines suggests they were simply a transaction cost. A brothel keeper knew that every quarter he would be fined for selling meat on a Friday or allowing spinning in the house, and he paid it with a shrug. It was the price of doing business, a subscription fee for tolerance. Historians debate the morality of this sin tax. Did the city fathers feel guilt? The records suggest a remarkable ability to compartmentalize. They would use the money from the brothels to pay for the night watchmen who guarded the respectable neighborhoods, or even to pay for candles in the local chapel. It was a form of moral money laundering. The coin earned in the dark was spent in the light, and by the time it reached the stonemason building, the new bridge, it was just silver again. There is a specific irony in the city of Toulouse, where the profits from the municipal brothel, the Chateau Vert, were shared between the city and the university. The very institution teaching theology and ethics was being partially funded by the sexual labor of the city's poorest women. But the city's involvement went beyond just taking a cut. They also set the prices to prevent price gouging and ensure that even the poorer journeymen could afford relief. The town council often set a maximum price for a standard visit. This price fixing turned the woman's body into a utility, like a loaf of bread or a pint of ale, with a cost regulated by the state to prevent civil unrest. If the price of sex got too high, the apprentices might riot. If it got too low, the women might starve, or rather, the keeper's profits would dip. The council balanced this equation with cold mathematical precision. However, the flow of money was not always smooth. We see court cases where the city sues a former brothel keeper for embezzlement, or where a keeper sues the city for failing to repair the roof of the public house. These legal battles reveal the mundane, business-like nature of the arrangement. They argue over roof tiles and firewood, not souls and sin. In one striking example from a German town, the brothel keeper petitioned the council for a raise, arguing that the cost of girls had gone up and he could no longer maintain the quality of the establishment on his current stipend. The council debated it, voted, and granted him the funds. It is a moment of bureaucratic banality that chills the blood far more than any fire and brimstone sermon. Yet, for the women, this municipal ownership offered a double-edged sword. On one hand, a city-run house was often safer than a private, illegal den. The king of the ribbalds, or the town bailiff, would step in if a client became too violent, not out of charity, but to protect city property. The women were assets. On the other hand, It meant the state was their pimp. There was no escaping the system because the system was the law. If a woman tried to leave the municipal house and work independently to keep all her earnings, she was hunted down not just as a sinner, but as a tax evader. She was undercutting the city's monopoly. The punishment for freelancing was severe: banishment or public humiliation, because she was threatening the revenue stream of the town hall. As the council meeting adjourns, the aldermen gather their velvet robes and head home to their wives, satisfied that the city's accounts are in order. The sun sets, and the great house by the wall lights its lanterns. The coins begin to change hands again. The silver groat moves from the soldier to the woman, from the woman to the keeper, and eventually back to the heavy iron chest in the council chamber. It is a closed loop of exploitation, a perpetual motion machine fueled by human need. But even the best regulated machine has parts that grind and break. The city can write laws and set prices. It can appoint keepers and collect taxes, but it cannot legislate the chaos of human rage. There is a rougher edge to this world, a place where the veneer of municipal order cracks and the violence underneath spills out. For the woman in the room, the council's protection is a piece of paper, but the fist of the drunken client is real bone and muscle. We must now leave the safety of the ledger and step into the moment when the deal goes wrong. The heavy oak door of the council chamber shuts with a reassuring thud, sealing the clean, orderly world of ledgers and laws inside. But out here, in the narrow, unlit corridor of the night, the paper shield of the law offers very little protection against the blunt force of human rage. We have spoken of regulations, taxes, and inspections as if the medieval sex trade were a well-oiled machine. But machines have gears that grind, and in the stews, the friction is flesh against flesh, and the sparks often ignite sudden, terrifying fires. The rougher edge of this life is not found in the statutes, but in the silence that follows a scream no one chooses to hear. To understand the violence, we must remember who the clients are. They are men trained in war, men drunk on cheap ale, or young students fueled by the toxic bravado of the pack. They carry knives. Every medieval man carries a knife for eating and work, and often swords or heavy cudgels. Into this volatile mix steps the woman, armed only with her wits and the fragile authority of the house rules. A dispute over a price, a perceived insult, or simply the cruel whim of a man who feels he has bought the right to do as he pleases can shatter the peace in an instant. The legal reality is a cold, hard wall. In the medieval courtroom, the concept of raptus, rape, was a crime against property. It was the theft of a woman's virginity from her father, or her chastity from her husband. Since a prostitute was considered to have no chastity and no owner but herself or the town, the law struggled to comprehend how she could be raped. In the eyes of many jurists, she was public. Public. How can one steal what is offered for sale? This horrific logic meant that if a prostitute dragged her battered body before a magistrate to accuse a client of assault, she faced a skeptical, if not hostile, audience. The burden of proof was crushing. She had to prove she had resisted, that she had raised the hue and cry, the mandatory legal scream that summoned the neighbors. But in the brothel district, the hue and cry was often just background noise, ignored by neighbors who had learned to mind their own business. Historians have uncovered chilling court records that reveal the systemic nature of this violence. In 14th century Paris, a group of university students, the sons of good families, broke into a bathhouse, not to buy services, but to destroy. They smashed the furniture, beat the keeper, and assaulted the women. When the case came to court, the defense was not that they didn't do it, but that the women were vile creatures who deserved no better. The punishment? A fine often paid by their wealthy fathers. The students returned to their lectures. The women were left to sweep up the shards of their livelihood. There is a sense of sport in these accounts that makes the modern blood run cold. Violence as a bonding ritual for the privileged. But the danger was not always from a stranger. The brothel keeper, that civil servant we met earlier, could easily turn into a tyrant. The line between a manager and a captor was thin. If a woman tried to hold back earnings or refused a particularly rough client, the keeper used the fist to enforce the contract. In the archives of London, we find the tragic case of a woman named Desiderata, who in the late 13th century accused her keeper of holding her prisoner and beating her. It is a rare voice breaking through the silence, a testament to the fact that for many, the house was a prison. Yet, as dangerous as the brothels were, they offered a sliver of collective security. A scream in a crowded house might bring a bouncer, or at least a witness. The true terrifying solitude belonged to the women who worked outside the system, the hedge whores, or fields de champs. These were the women who could not afford the fees of the official brothels, or who had been rejected by them due to age or illness. They worked in the open, under the hedges of the city walls, in the damp cellars of ruined buildings, or in the dry ditches beyond the gates. Here, there were no walls, no keepers, and no lights. A woman working the hedge was entirely alone with the man she met in the dark. If he decided to strangle her for the copper coins in her pocket, the only witness was the moon. The violence of the rougher edge also took on a ritualistic form in the punishment of those who broke the rules. We must look at the shaming processions. If a woman was caught working illegally, or if she dared to wear the clothes of a respectable wife, the city did not just fine her, it invited the mob to punish her. She might be carted through the streets to the sound of rough music, banging pots and pans, while the crowd threw filth and jeered. In some French towns, the punishment was the course. The woman was chased through the streets by the town's young men, whipped and beaten until she reached the city gates and was expelled. This was state-sanctioned violence, a public theater where the city cleansed itself by brutalizing the scapegoat. The psychological toll of being the target of an entire city's scorn is unimaginable. To see the baker you bought bread from, or the neighbor you once knew, contorted with rage, throwing a stone, it destroyed not just the body, but the soul's connection to humanity. There is a small, quiet detail that haunts the records of these violent encounters: the mention of pledges. When a prostitute was arrested or accused, she often had no family to stand bail for her. So who stepped in? Often it was other poor women, laundresses, alewives, or fellow sex workers. They pledged their own meager household goods, a brass pot or a feather bed, to bail their friend out of jail. In the face of a legal system that saw them as disposable, and a client base that saw them as targets, these women formed a phalanx of sisterhood. It was a fragile shield, woven from friendship and shared trauma, but it was the only one they had. As we witness a woman tending to a split lip in the reflection of a rain barrel, or bandaging a bruised rib with a strip of old linen, we see the physical cost of the medieval economy. The violence is not an accident. It is a structural flaw in a building built on hypocrisy. The society that demands her service also demands her suffering to assuage its own guilt. She must be available, but she must also be punishable. The night is deep now, and the pain is a dull throb. For some women, the cycle of violence and recovery becomes too heavy to bear. The body breaks, or the spirit snaps. When the street offers only danger, and the brothel offers only servitude, where does a woman go? Is there a door that opens out? In the distance, through the mist, we see the faint glow of a different kind of lantern. It does not hang over a tavern or a bathhouse, but over the gate of a severe stone building. It is the house of the repentant, the sanctuary of the Magdalene. It promises safety, but as with all things in this twilight world, the price of admission is high. We must wipe the blood from the stone and walk towards the sound of chanting to see if the church offers a mercy that the street does not. The silence of the Magdalene house is heavy, pressing against the ears like deep water. As we step through the heavy timber gates, the raucous noise of the street, the shouts of the hawkers, the rattle of carts, the drunken songs, is severed instantly. We are in the Convent of the Repentant Sisters, a fortress of stone and silence built to salvage the souls of the women we have been watching. The air here smells of strong lye soap, damp wool, and the faint, sweet smoke of incense. It is a smell of aggressive purification, a scent that seeks to scrub the memory of the brothel from the skin itself. Across Europe, from the Couvent des Filles Dieu in Paris to the White Ladies of German cities, these institutions arose as the medieval answer to the problem of the prostitute. They were named for Mary Magdalene, the biblical figure conflated by medieval tradition into the ultimate repentant sinner. The promise was simple: trade your freedom for your soul. If a woman was weary of the beatings, the disease, and the cold, she could knock on this door. But the price of admission was the total erasure of her former self. Watch as a new arrival enters the vestibule. She is young, perhaps 20, her face worn by the rough winds of the street. The first act of the sisters is not to embrace her, but to strip her. The colorful dress, the yellow cord, the striped hood, all the trappings of her trade are taken away and burned or sold. Then comes the shears. The long hair, often a prostitute's only source of vanity and professional asset, is shown close to the scalp. It is a brutal, symbolic castration of her femininity. She is given a habit of undyed, scratchy wool, sometimes white to symbolize her desire for purity, sometimes gray to mark her as a penitent ashwalker. When she looks in the polished metal of a basin, she sees a stranger. She is no longer Alice or Margot. She is a sister of the penance. Life inside is a regimen of military strictness. The day is carved up by bells calling to prayer. But between the prayers lies the true engine of the house, labor. The medieval mind believed that idleness was the devil's pillow, so the former prostitutes are worked to the bone. In many cities, the Magdalene houses hold a monopoly on the city's laundry. It is a grimly poetic assignment. The women considered stained are forced to spend their lives scrubbing the stains out of the linens of the respectable class. They stand for hours over steaming vats, their hands raw and red, washing the sheets of the very men who might have once visited them in the stews. There is a dark, unspoken humor in the city squares about this, that the cleanest shirts in town are washed by the dirtiest women. But inside the walls, there is little laughter. Historians still debate the true nature of these houses. Were they sanctuaries or prisons? The records show a disturbing mix. For some women, undoubtedly, the house was a lifeline. It offered 3 meals a day, a roof that didn't leak, and protection from violent pimps. We find letters of genuine gratitude, women who found a strange, quiet peace in the rhythm of the liturgy. But for others, it was a correctional facility. Courts would often sentence women to the Magdalene house for reform, dragging them there against their will. Families scandalized by a daughter's behavior would commit her, paying a dowry to the convent to keep her locked away, effectively burying their shame alive. Once inside, the doors were bolted from the outside. In strict orders, the women were never allowed to leave. They took vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, effectively becoming nuns, but nuns of a lower caste, forever marked by their past. They were often forbidden from speaking to the pure nuns who managed the house, creating a hierarchy of virtue even within the sanctuary. A sister of the penance could pray for forgiveness, but she was never allowed to forget why she needed it. Yet, human nature is stubborn. Even in this austere environment, we find cracks in the wall. Archives in Italy reveal scandals where repentant sisters climbed over garden walls to meet lovers or smuggled in wine and ribbons. In one infamous case, a Magdalene house in Florence was found to be operating a side business selling fine embroidery, with the sisters using the profits to buy better food and soften their harsh existence. It reminds us that these women were survivors, adaptable and spirited, and no amount of wool or prayer could entirely extinguish the spark that kept them alive on the streets. There was, however, a third path out of the house, one that society surprisingly encouraged. In a twist of medieval pragmatism, a man could come to the Magdalene house to shop for a wife. It was considered a great act of charity and a spiritual bonus to marry a repentant whore. The logic was that by marrying her, the man was permanently saving her from returning to sin. The house would provide a small dowry, often earned from that endless laundry, and the woman would re-enter society, her past technically erased by the sacrament of marriage. It was a redemption roulette. Would she find a kind husband who genuinely wanted to save her, or a brute looking for a cheap wife with no family to defend her? As night falls over the convent, the chanting of the Compline service rises into the rafters. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy. The voices are a blend of the young and the old, the forced and the willing. In the candlelit chapel, their shadowed faces look identical. Stripped of the paint and the patches of the street, they have traded the chaos of the brothel for the order of the tomb. They are safe here, hidden away from the judgment of the market square. But outside these thick stone walls, the world is changing. The wind blowing from the south carries something heavier than rain. It is the late 15th century. Ships are returning from the New World, or perhaps moving troops from Naples, and they are bringing a passenger that no wall can keep out. It is not a client, and it is not a magistrate. It is a microbe. The era of the necessary evil, of the regulated, tolerated brothel, is about to crash into a biological wall. A new sickness is coming, one that does not just burn, but destroys, disfigures, and kills with terrifying speed. The French disease is at the gates, and it will turn the medieval garden of vice into a graveyard. The year is 1495, and the wind blowing north from the Italian peninsula carries a scent that will curdle the blood of Europe. We are hovering over the army of Charles VIII of France, a glittering, chaotic force that has just conquered Naples. But as the soldiers celebrate their victory, drinking in the taverns and visiting the camp followers, something invisible and monstrous is waking up. It begins as a small sore, easily dismissed by men used to the rough life of the camp. But it does not heal. Within days, it blooms into a nightmare. A rash of angry, green-weeping pustules erupts across the body, covering the face and the hands, emitting a stench so foul that attendants struggle to stay in the room. This is not the familiar burning of the medieval stews. This is a plague that seems to eat the flesh from the bones while the victim is still breathing. It is the arrival of the great pox, the disease we now know as syphilis, but in a strain so virulent and aggressive that it terrified doctors and kings alike. The medieval world, with its delicate balance of sin and tolerance, is about to be shattered by a microbe that refuses to follow the rules. As the mercenary army disbands and soldiers return to their homes in France, Germany, and Switzerland, they bring the souvenir of Naples with them. The spread is terrifyingly fast. By 1497, the disease is in Paris. By 1498, it has reached Bristol and Moscow. And as it travels, it sparks the greatest game of diplomatic name-calling in history. No one wants to claim this monster. The French, with a sniff of disdain, call it the Neapolitan disease, blaming the city they just invaded. The Italians, naturally, call it the morbus gallicus, the French disease. The English, not wanting to be left out of the finger-pointing, also call it the French pox, while the Russians call it the Polish sickness, and the Turks call it the Christian disease. Syphilis, it seems, is the ultimate patriot. It always belongs to the neighbors. There is a dark, dry humor in watching nations try to export the blame on a map, while the bacteria itself recognizes no borders. But for the people on the ground, there is no laughter, only a panicked realization that the old protections, the bathhouses, the regulations, the hygiene theories are utterly useless. The impact on the prostitutes is catastrophic. In the panicked logic of the time, the woman is seen not as a fellow victim, but as a poisonous vessel. Medical writers of the period, struggling to explain the sudden outbreak, theorize that the disease is created when a woman's body becomes overheated by too many partners, effectively brewing a toxic venom in her womb that burns the men who touch her. It is a horrific distortion of biology that places the entire blame for the epidemic on the sex worker. She is now a biological weapon. We see the mood in the cities shift overnight from tolerance to terror. The stews and bathhouses, once the noisy social hubs of the city, fall silent. Customers are too afraid to enter. The steam that once promised cleanliness now feels like a conduit for contagion. In 1497, the Town Council of Aberdeen in Scotland issues a brutal decree. All light women must stop their work or be branded on the cheek with a red-hot iron and banished. It is a frantic, violent attempt to cauterize the city. Scholars today are still locked in a fierce debate about where this horror came from. The Columbian theory suggests that Columbus's sailors brought the bacteria back from the Americas in 1493, a grim exchange for the smallpox Europe sent west. The timing aligns perfectly. The outbreak in Naples happens just shortly after the ship's return. However, other historians argue for the pre-Columbian theory, suggesting the disease was always present in Europe, perhaps misdiagnosed as leprosy, and that it simply mutated into a more deadly form in the chaotic, squalid conditions of the military camps. Whether it came from a new world or an old mutation, the result was the same. The sexual freedom of the medieval city was effectively cancelled. The medical treatments of the time offer a glimpse into the desperation of the age. With Galenic herbal remedies failing, doctors turn to alchemy. The primary weapon becomes mercury. Patients are rubbed with mercury ointments, made to inhale mercury vapors in fumigation boxes, or given pills of mercury to swallow. The logic is that the heavy metal will cause the patient to salivate excessively, drooling pints of saliva a day, and thus purge the poison from the body. The tragedy, of course, is that mercury is highly toxic. We watch as patients' teeth loosen and fall out, their gums turn black, and their minds unravel into madness. The cure is often just a slower, more painful death than the disease. The saying, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," is born in these dark years, a grim proverb whispered in the taverns to warn young men that the price of pleasure has gone up. There is also the holy wood craze. A tropical wood called guayacum is imported from the Americas, sold at astronomical prices by merchants like the Fuggers of Augsburg. It is boiled into a tea and promised as a miracle cure. It is useless, of course, but it makes the merchants incredibly rich and gives the dying a flicker of expensive hope. In the midst of this, the prostitute finds herself more isolated than ever. If she shows a single mark on her face, she is cast out of the brothel. She cannot go to the hospital, for many charitable hospitals refuse to treat boxed patients, viewing their illness as a direct punishment from God. She dies in the hedge or the ditch, her body a testament to the new cruelty of the age. The filthy truth here is that the Great Box killed the medieval concept of charity. Before, the leper was a figure of pity, a chance to do good works. Now, the box victim is a figure of disgust, a sinner getting exactly what they deserve. The empathy of the Middle Ages hardens into the moral judgment of the early modern era. As we look through the window of a closing bathhouse in Nuremberg, we see the keeper extinguishing the lamps. The water in the tubs is cold. The laughter is gone. The French disease has done what 1,000 sermons could not. It has made the flesh terrifying. The permissive, pragmatic world of the medieval city, where a bishop could be a landlord and a town council could run a brothel, is collapsing under the weight of fear. The doors are bolting shut, and as the physical doors close, the spiritual doors are also slamming. A new kind of religious fervor is sweeping across Europe, a reformation that will have no patience for necessary evils. The final act of our story will not be played out in the bedroom, but in the pulpit and the courtroom, where the last remnants of medieval tolerance will be swept away by men who believe that to save the city, they must destroy its pleasures. The sound of the Middle Ages dying is not the clash of swords or the fanfare of trumpets. It is the dry, rhythmic scratching of a pen on parchment, followed by the heavy thud of an iron bolt sliding home. As we move into the 16th century, the atmosphere of our journey shifts dramatically. The humid, permissive warmth of the bathhouse and the flickering ambiguity of the lantern light are blown away by a harsh, biting wind of moral certainty. The era of the necessary evil is over. The filthy truth is no longer something to be managed, taxed, and tolerated. It is something to be eradicated. We are witnessing the great shutting of the doors, a moment when Europe decided that it could no longer live with its own contradictions. The catalyst for this seismic shift is a perfect storm of biological terror and theological revolution. We have seen how the French disease made the flesh terrifying, but now a German monk named Martin Luther is making the soul terrified. The Protestant Reformation, exploding out of Wittenberg in 1517, tears up the old medieval compromise. Luther and his followers have no patience for the sophisticated arguments of St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. They look at the sewer in the palace metaphor and recoil. To the Protestant mind, the existence of a state-sanctioned brothel is not a safety valve for society. It is a state-sponsored insult to God. They argue that the government has a duty to police the morals of its citizens, not just their wallets. The city must become a new Jerusalem, and there is no red light district in heaven. In the Protestant cities of Germany and Switzerland, the crackdown is swift and brutal. In Augsburg, the brothels are closed in 1532. In Basel, in 1534. In Ulm, in 1537. The Frauenhäuser, that were once the pride of the municipal council, are shuttered, their furniture sold, their keepers fired. The women are given a stark choice: marry, leave the city, or face the whip. There is a cold administrative efficiency to it. The same councils that once debated the price of firewood for the bathhouse now debate the most efficient way to expel the women who worked there. It is a bureaucratic about-face that leaves thousands of women destitute overnight. But the Catholics are not to be outdone in this moral arms race. The Church, reeling from the accusations of corruption and hypocrisy, launches its own counter-reformation. The Council of Trent gathers to scrub the stains from the Church's reputation, and the embarrassing fact that bishops have been acting as brothel landlords is high on the list of things to fix. In Rome, Pope Pius V eventually expels the prostitutes from the Holy City, only to let them back in when the tax revenue collapses. A brief, cynical flicker of the old ways. But the mood has permanently darkened. The courtesan, once a celebrated figure of Renaissance culture, is pushed into the shadows. The veil of tolerance is torn down. Nowhere is this drama more theatrical than in London. The year is 1546. King Henry VIII, a man whose own marital history is, to put it mildly, a complex tapestry of desire and discard, decides to play the moral arbiter. In the dying days of his reign, he issues a proclamation that ends centuries of history with a single stroke. The Southwark stews are to be closed. The liberty of the clink is revoked. The king's trumpeters ride through the streets, reading the decree that orders the brothel keepers to cease their trade and the women to vacate the premises. It is a supreme irony that the king who broke the church to marry a new wife is the one to shut down the brothels in the name of propriety. You can almost hear the ghostly laughter of his 6 wives echoing in the empty halls of the Cardinal's Hat and the Cross Keys. This moment marks a fundamental legal shift. Prostitution moves from being a sin, spiritual, to a crime, secular. In the Middle Ages, the penalty was a fine, a tax. Now, the penalty is physical punishment and hard labor. we see the rise of a new kind of institution, grim and grey, the bridewell. Originally a royal palace, it is transformed into a house of correction for the idle and the disorderly. The women who once walked the streets in yellow hoods are now dragged into these cold stone halls. They are not there to be saved in the gentle manner of the Magdalen house. They are there to be broken. They are forced to beat hemp, pounding thick fibrous stalks with heavy wooden mallets from dawn till dusk, and are whipped if they stop. The sound of the hemp beating becomes the new rhythm of the city's underbelly, replacing the laughter of the bathhouse. The architecture of the city changes. The visible red light districts, with their signs and their designated streets, are dismantled. The groped lanes are renamed, often to something innocuous like Grape Lane or Magpie Lane, in a linguistic attempt to sanitize the map. But did the trade disappear? Of course not. History teaches us that prohibition rarely stops supply. It merely poisons the quality. Prostitution did not vanish. It disintegrated. It moved from the large, regulated, great houses into the back alleys, the private rooms of taverns, and the cellars of unsuspecting lodging houses. It became the black economy. For the women, this new reality was infinitely more dangerous. Without the, admittedly flawed, protection of the official brothel keeper and the city watch, they were now entirely at the mercy of the underground. They worked in secret, moving constantly to avoid the beadle, the parish officer charged with hunting them down. The whore was no longer a recognized, if despised, member of the social order. She was a fugitive. The camaraderie of the communal house was replaced by the paranoia of the solitary walker. The yellow cord was gone, but the invisible mark was heavier than ever. There is a tragic sensory shift in the records. We stop reading about stew holders and bath attendants and start reading about vagrants and night walkers. The language becomes stripped of any professional dignity. The women are lumped in with thieves, beggars, and cut purses. They are the disorderly poor, a nuisance to be swept up and hidden away. The medical crisis of syphilis continues to rage, but now, because the trade is hidden, it is even harder to track or treat. The disease festers in the dark, driven underground by the very laws designed to stop it. As we stand on the banks of the Thames, looking at the shuttered windows of the Southwark brothels in the year 1550, the silence is profound. The painted signs are taken down. The fires in the bathhouses are cold. The river laps against the wood, indifferent to the change. The medieval compromise, that strange, hypocritical, but functional agreement between the sacred and the profane, is dead. The modern era has begun, bringing with it a sharper division between the public face of virtue and the private reality of vice. The world has become more moral on the surface, but underneath, the desperation remains. Only now it has no name and no address. We have walked a long road from the lantern-lit cobbles of the 12th century to the cold, locked doors of the 16th. We have seen the bishop's ledger, the bathhouse steam, the yellow hood, and the mercury cure. We have met Alice, Margot, and the nameless thousands who stood in the rain. Now, as the lights of history fade and the timeline dissolves, we must take one final step. We must look back at what we have seen and ask ourselves what lingers. The buildings are gone, the laws are dust, but the echoes remain. It is time to listen to the silence they left behind. The lantern flame flickers one last time, struggling against the encroaching dark, and then, with a wisp of grey smoke, it vanishes. We are left standing in the quiet aftermath of centuries, looking at the empty spaces where the noisy, messy, vibrant world of the medieval stews once stood. The physical structures have largely been erased. The timber-framed brothels of Suffolk burned to ash in the fires of later centuries, or were pulled down to make way for warehouses and railways. The bathhouses of Paris were paved over, their stone foundations buried deep beneath the asphalt of the modern boulevards. The gropekant lanes have been renamed, scrubbed clean of their crude honesty, by Victorian mapmakers who found the medieval bluntness too shocking for polite society. If you walk these streets today, you will find no plaques, no monuments, and no statues dedicated to the women who worked the night shift of history. They have become the ghosts of the archives, visible only in the negative space of the records, in the gaps between the laws, the silences between the sermons, and the margins of the tax rolls. This silence is the final indignity. We know the names of the kings who regulated them, the bishops who collected their rent, and the poets who satirized them. We know the theology of Aquinas and the decrees of Henry VIII, but the women themselves, they are mostly nameless. They appear in the court rolls as Alice, Joan, or Magdalene, often without a surname, defined only by their crime or their debt. They are statistical blips, entries in a ledger of sin. History, written by the men who visited them or the men who condemned them, has rarely bothered to ask who they were when the door was closed and the client was gone. It has failed to record the sound of their voices, the specific texture of their fears, or the small private hopes they held for a life beyond the yellow cord. We are left with caricatures, the lusty wench, the tragic victim, the diseased crone. The complex, breathing human reality has been flattened into a morality play. Yet, as we stand in this darkness, if we listen with more than just our ears, if we listen with our empathy, the silence begins to fill with echoes. We can sense the sheer, stubborn resilience of these women. They were the ultimate survivors of a brutal age. In a world that denied them legal rights, economic independence, and social dignity, they carved out a space to live. They navigated a landscape of predatory laws and biological terrors with a grit that demands our respect. They were not merely daughters of Eve or vessels of sin. They were mothers feeding children, sisters nursing the sick, and friends bailing each other out of jail with a pledged brass pot. They were the mortar in the walls of the medieval city, the invisible labor force that allowed the masculine world of guilds, universities, and armies to function. The city used them, profited from them, and then tried to forget them. But the city is built on their bones. Nowhere is this more literal than in the Crossbones graveyard in London, perhaps the most poignant memorial to this forgotten history. For centuries, it was an unconsecrated patch of mud where the single women of the stews were dumped, denied the rights of the church that had happily taken their money in life. Today, it is a garden of remembrance, its iron gates tied with thousands of colorful ribbons, feathers, and trinkets left by modern visitors. It is a spontaneous, grassroots shrine to the outcast. Standing there, one feels a powerful collapse of time. The rejection of the medieval church has been answered by the embrace of the modern pilgrim. The ribald songs of the bathhouse have been replaced by a respectful silence. The Winchester geese have finally found a flock. The filthy truth about medieval prostitution, in the end, is not about dirt or disease or sex. It is about the uncomfortable mirror it holds up to society. The medieval world liked to believe it was ordered, pious, and just, with a place for everyone and everyone in their place. But the brothel proved that this order was a lie. It revealed that the church was a business, that the law was a commodity, and that morality was flexible when there was profit to be made. The prostitute was the glitch in the system that exposed the hypocrisy of the whole machine. She was the one who bore the weight of the city's double standards on her shoulders. She was punished for the desires of others, branded for the fears of others, and exiled for the sins of others. As we drift away from this history, moving back toward the waking world, we must carry with us the understanding that these women were not other. They were not a separate species of sinner. They were the inevitable result of a society that limited women's choices to the convent, the cradle, or the street. They were Alice, cold and hungry in Bristol. They were Margot, pinning on the yellow band in Paris. They were the unnamed girl in the bathhouse in Nuremberg, wondering if the new sickness would take her before winter. They were us, stripped of our modern safety nets and antibiotics, trying to survive the long, dark night. The heavy wooden doors of the Middle Ages have closed. The stews are gone. The lantern light has faded into the electric glow of the present. But the echoes remain. They are in the way we still struggle with the policing of women's bodies. They are in the way we still debate the morality of sex work. They are in the way we still try to draw lines between the good woman and the bad woman. The medieval mind is not as far away as we like to think. But tonight, we do not judge. We simply witness. We offer these women the one thing their own time refused them: a moment of gentle, unblemished remembrance. We let them step out of the shadow of the necessary evil and just be human for a moment, tired, flawed, resilient, and real. The night watchman has passed. The curfew bell has rung. The city sleeps, and its secrets are safe with us. The journey is over. The wet cobblestones have dried. The heavy smell of wood smoke and incense has faded, and the voices of the past have whispered their final secrets into the dark. You are back in the safety of your own time, warm and protected, far from the chill of the medieval riverbank. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Feel the weight of the history you have witnessed lifting off your chest, replaced by a soft, heavy blanket of calm. The past is a story that has already been written. It cannot hurt you now. You can let the images of the lanterns and the stone walls drift away like leaves on a slow-moving stream. Your breathing is slow, steady, and deep. The world is quiet. The shadows are just shadows. You are safe. You are at rest. And the history sleeps with you. Sweet dreams.